words before. Probably is like an answer to like, oh, I don't know, literally any tech-related question you've ever asked someone. You know, maybe. And despite the fact that this particular version of It Depends is spitting out rainbow particles, which is pretty cool, it's still like not really that helpful, right? It's like painfully accurate, yet also not at all helpful in answering the question you actually had. Because you're like, cool, it depends. But on what? And which part of the it depends am I using? Because can you just give me an actual answer? Or maybe you get slightly less frustrated than that. It really depends on the time of day, I guess. And this is definitely an answer you're going to get if you ask someone, what should I use to animate a thing on my website or my web app or whatever you're working on? There's definitely going to be an it depends going on. And that just makes it a little bit, frustrating. So this morning I wanted to dig into like what that it depends means when it comes to web animation. Like what does it depend on? What are your options? And how do you get to a better answer than just it depends? So to do that, or basically what we want to do is next time you're presented with this question, I want to help you have a better answer. That fourth one just gets you every time. In order to answer this question, to have like a better guide for answering this question, to get past our it depends, we need to enter the world of web animation. I bet you didn't know it looked like this. I didn't either. Finding this map is hard. No, not really. So we have so many options, so many ways we can make things move on the web, and we're going to talk about it more in terms of like when we're trying to animate things for UI, animate interface elements, just to narrow it down just a little bit and take a look at what all of these things can offer. And I want to look at them in sort of the like practical sense of like you have teammates you need to convince to work with you, you have deadlines and budgets to work on, because technically any of these things can do absolutely anything you want them to if you have enough time and patience, but teammates, bosses, budgets, and timelines don't always work like that. So we'll try to keep it just a bit practical. So the first island I want to stop at is the CSS island. Because for me, I was telling my workshop yesterday, I was like, if there was like an easy answer that's going to get me a whole lot of like free wins and like less work for me, I'm going to go for that one because I'm generally a lazy person. And CSS is often that when it comes to web animation. A lot of the time, CSS can get the job done, and you can just do it with a little less effort than some other options. So if it can do the thing you need it to do, it's a great place to start. So the things that CSS are super awesome at are things with really well-defined state transitions. So you know where you're going from and where you're going to, even if it's not actually a motion. You just have those things defined. They're really great for loading animations, things that loop. CSS is really good at looping, maybe you've noticed. And anything that's on hover or focus or some other event that CSS has access to. It doesn't have them all, but it's got a few, and it's real good at those events that it has access to. So things are better in examples instead of lists. So that's things like this, which is like fancy pants hover with some like blur stuff going on. Still a hover, still CSS. Magical. For making things load into place and they can just like show up where they're supposed to be and you're like, here's your interface, yay. CSS is pretty great for that. Little looping animations, maybe to alert people to stuff with cute little bells. Just like, hey, you have messages. The unfortunate looping hiccup there is me, not them. Whoops, bad video. And then of course also loaders, which I would highly recommend sticking with one per page, but whatever, here's a whole bunch of them at once. Like, I just couldn't decide, so I used like 9. Try saying that in a meeting, see what happens. And all of these so far have been pretty small relative to like the size of the screen. They're all very small pieces, but CSS can do things that take over the whole screen too, like this nice giant full screen animation, or navigation animation. So the one thing these all have in common is like all that stuff from that list. Like this one, there's a defined state of where it's coming from, where it's going to. That text starts really big and in front of the screen, and then like being invisible and like scales back down to an opacity of 1. And that big pink screen, big pink block just basically goes from opacity of 0 to an opacity of 1. So you know exactly where things are going to be at the beginning and end, and then you just like hand it over to CSS to fill in the inside, fill in that middle part. And it's pretty good with it. So some advantages of working with CSS. There's no external library needed, like nothing. I'm still coming up late, but I'm trying to think of an example of a thing you might make on the web that involves no CSS at all. Pretty tough. There's usually some in there somewhere. It's probably already there, probably already using it. And this means with nothing extra to load, you don't have to like have a meeting about like, can we add more things to our page load? Can we use one more library? I've also heard from some designers who are like, aren't allowed to touch the JavaScript, but they are allowed to touch the CSS. So they can just go put some animation in. They don't have to ask anyone. So that can be a pretty good plus right there. There's great potential for performance, but basically you get a lot of things for free performance-wise if you're smart about the CSS you use. It's not to say you can't get good performance using something else. You just maybe have to do 1 or 2 extra steps to ask for it, and CSS might just have it already, because it's just, like I said, it's sometimes the lazy, easy option. One other thing with CSS is their keyframes are reusable. You can write a set of CSS keyframes and just reuse it over and over and over and over, and you get the idea. There's no limit to how many things you can use it on. You can just keep reusing it. It can become very modular if you plan it out in a nice modular kind of way. And of course, you can adjust things in media queries, which is true for not just CSS, but kind of nice to know. If you need to make things responsive, it's really easy to adjust your CSS animations in your CSS. That's pretty obvious. Okay, so that's all the good stuff. But what about the less good stuff? Like, obviously, we wouldn't have this whole map where all these options of CSS could do everything. So some of the I guess, cons of working with CSS. You have access to limited events, obviously. There's only so much that CSS knows about what's going on in the browser viewport, or where like pointer things are, and all that kind of stuff. You have to pretty much know everything ahead of time. Like CSS, you generally write your animations in your CSS, and they're there, and they're fairly difficult to change after the fact. Like unless you like doing a lot of string manipulation, which that's weird. Just so you know. Right now, you can't separate your transform properties. So in CSS, if you want to like rotate something and scale something, that's all part of the transform property. Kind of awesome, super powerful, but it's all part of one property, which means if you want to animate your scale and your rotation separately, things can get weird, or hard, or impossible, depending on what you're going for. I have a little asterisk there because right now, you can have these properties separated out behind a flag in Chrome Canary. So if your audience is only people with a flag turned on in Chrome Canary, go nuts. This point doesn't apply to you. Also, please tell me about your work. How do you get there? So one thing that people tend to forget a lot about when it comes to using CSS for web animation is the fact that CSS and JavaScript totally work good together. They're friends. They like each other. I mean, I know it's really cool on the internet to like pick one that you like and say the other one sucks, because that's just how the internet works, but they're actually friends. I've talked to them. I really have. You know, talk to your code. That's weird. So CSS and JavaScript, you can use them together to get over some of those disadvantages of CSS, kind of get you over that wall that you hit with CSS animation. For example, you can use JavaScript for the logic of like time, like what time has gone by, what things should happen, and then have it kind of fire off basically CSS transitions or animations, which is what's happening in this Stripe kind of product explainer. The logic is all being handled by JavaScript as far as like how much time has passed. Are we 2 seconds in? All right, you fire, now you go back. And that's basically what it's doing. JavaScript is kind of orchestrating all of this, but all the actual motion is taken care of by CSS. Pretty nice way to get like a best of both worlds kind of situation. And who doesn't love that? You can also use it in like a smaller scale kind of thing where you use JavaScript to figure out what events are happening, events that CSS doesn't have access to, like clicks and taps and all that stuff, and then fire off some CSS animation by like swapping classes or whatever you want to do based on that event. This is Medium. Whoops. This is Medium, and they do this really nicely with their little kind of content adding button. Where they're like, click the icon, yay, icons come out. And the actual click events handled with JavaScript, but those icons all coming out and being visible and doing their thing is all done with CSS. So there's a possibility to use two together. It's totally okay. It actually is sometimes a lot more fun to do. It gets you past those little hurdles. So to summarize CSS Island, the things that CSS is like super good at, the places it really shines, is interactions with defined states, simple interactive animations. And simple, I mean here, not in like the bad way of like, well, it's just so simple. It's not like the dumb kind of simple. It's like things that are just really, the kind of animations we tend to see in a lot of UI things are like fades, they're scales, they're small and simple movements, simple property changes, but they're very effective with the way we use them in designs. So a lot of your kind of baseline UI animations on the web, CSS is like gonna take care of them really well for you. So that's simple in the best way possible. The main advantage of them is you can get some performance for cheap or little effort, and there's no additional resources required. So if you have some performance budget stuff or just care about performance things, you can get away with a lot without having to load in extra stuff. And you'd have to write a lot of animations to make your CSS extra heavier or noticeably heavier. That could be a challenge for you all for later. See how many animations you have to write before. Don't really do that. Anyways, this talk also includes includes some really bad advice. Good advice and bad advice, just mixing it up. So the one question that usually always follows the question of like, what is CSS good at, is this question of like, all right, so CSS obviously has limits. There is only so far it can get me. It can do a lot of things, but there's a limit to what it can do. How do I know when to switch to like looking at JavaScript solutions? So you might rephrase that as CSS is pretty great, but when is it time to move to JavaScript? I have some thoughts on that. So the first one is if you are chaining together more than three or so animations in a sequence. So with CSS, if you want to have one animation fire, then the next, and the next, you have to like coordinate all their durations and delays. Not so bad. I mean, people do a lot of really complex animation with CSS on CodePen and everything. Pretty easy to like write off the first time, but the hard part comes in when someone asks you to edit it. And then they're like, oh, it should just be a little faster in the middle. And then you have to go and change all the animation durations and delay values before that and after that and in the middle. And then they're like, oh, did I say slower? I meant faster. And then you're just like, ah. So to save yourself that hair-pulling moment, when you have a long sequence, moving to a JavaScript solution is going to give you more flexibility in handling that logic. And just kind of making those edits that always come up. Like, I've never worked on a project, I've never done an animation for like a client thing or a work thing that no one has been like, had any edits for, or that I haven't had edits for. It's never like, I did it once and it was perfect. That's not, if you can work like that, awesome, but most of us can't. So there's that sequencing thing. If your animations need to be dynamic at runtime, if you are like, hey, it needs to go over there, but how far over there goes depends on where the person taps, or like how many things they have in their list, or whatever it is, something that you're not going to know until the page already loads, CSS might be a little bit too, just kind of, isn't going to be able to be dynamic like that. Like, it doesn't know how many objects are there, it doesn't know how far the mouse has gone, but something like JavaScript does know that, so that might be the better way to go. I feel like I almost need to have an asterisk on these two now that we have CSS variables, or aka CSS custom properties, because they will let you get a little bit more dynamic and make that shading a little bit more flexible, but they still only go so far, but they are kind of fun to play with. So imagine there's an asterisk there if you like CSS variables. Of course, if you need to animate properties separately, right now pretty much every JavaScript animation library can do that, and you can do that yourself. With JavaScript too, if you want to write it by hand, but CSS still has them tied together. And the very last one, because why have a list of 3 when you could have a list of 4? I can't think of a reason. If you want to create some like really realistic physics, like actual physics, not like referencing physics or pretend physics, actual physics. That's the technical term they use for physics. If you want that, or if you want some sort of complex easing beyond cubic Beziers, CSS can't really do that yet. I imagine at some point in time, CSS is going to get some more easing options beyond cubic Beziers, but that hasn't happened yet. So for now, if you need to get these fancier easings, things that are more like springs or more quadratic or whatever, JavaScript is the place you need to go for that. So you probably never guessed, but our next stop is JavaScript Island. These are real places. If I say that enough, it might be true, right? So the things that JavaScript is super awesome at, and that list kind of hints at some of these. Complex animated interactions, things that have a lot going on, things that have a lot of moving pieces, that just could get to the complexity that might be tough to maintain with CSS. Anything that goes along the lines of like narrative or immersive animations, kind of going beyond your like basic UI animations, right? Like if you're creating a site that's more trying to tell a story or bring people into a narrative, or all of those things, even something more like data vizy, JavaScript is going to be your better solution for that kind of stuff. It's going to be able to help you get more done more efficiently. And anything with dynamic state transitions, because CSS variables can do them a little, but to be really dynamic, JavaScript is still your best option. So some examples of that would be things like Stripe's little drop-down menu that has all these different lengths and widths and sizes. So it's a very similar transition on all of those, but they're transitioning from different sizes to different sizes, which makes more sense when you see it than when I say it. Some of them are wide, some of them are long. If they put this menu together and then someone was like, oh, we need like 20 things in that list instead of 5, JavaScript would be able to be flexible like that very easily. Or if they're like, hey, we actually need to add a drop-down on support too, like that would be really easy to add in because you could just kind of repeat that logic, as opposed to a CSS that might take you a lot more effort. Though there is totally a CSS version of this out there on CodePen if you want to give it a look. Drag and drop interactions, those are all over, but this is the most fun one I could find. you're supposed to like say how long you work and how long you sleep and stuff, but I feel like Jason might be judging me on that selection. But also things like, more drag and drop, and the way like that modal came in, it had like a double bounce. Like that's kind of the more complex easy that we see can do more easily with JavaScript too. So those sorts of things are ones where turning to JavaScript is probably going to make your life just a little bit easier and give you, being able to get like, just be a little bit more effective with it. Also, if you have more than one object that needs to respond to the same input, which this 3D lion, this cute little QB lion, his whole self, all the parts of his lion body respond to the mouse position. This happens in cases even when you don't have a lion, when you have multiple objects that need to respond to the same input. The lion was the cutest example I could find though, so I went with that one. So anytime you're kind of tying multiple property changes, multiple objects changes to one bit of input, JavaScript logic situation will help you out with that. And also when you want to kind of create these reusable chunks of animations, like little mini timelines, if you will. Like this little kind of portfolio slider where the studio is showing a bunch of different projects, but they have a very similar transition, well, exactly the same transition to all of them. So like on each one of these, they have like the photo does this little stripey thing, the title does this little like asterisk to letters thing, and then the paragraph shows up. And on all of these, they're like going to dynamic locations, right? Like the title is different every time, the photo is different every time, but they're reusing those animations and just pointing them at different objects. And that's a thing that's a lot easier to do in JavaScript as well. So it's like they did this in JavaScript, and that means if someone's like, we need to add 20 more projects, keep using 20 today. It's a good number. Go with it. That would be, they could just pop in like a few more destinations and have that keep going and running. So, of course the question of using JavaScript gets us one level deeper into it depends, right? Because like we've only gone one level deep so far. It can't be that easy. The question we have to ask ourselves, are we going to use like vanilla JavaScript and do it ourselves? Or are we going to use some sort of animation library, framework, whatever you want to call them? I like dessert metaphors. But this is a very specific metaphor because it's not that one is necessarily always going to be better than the other. You can do it yourself, or you can use kind of some scaffolding people have built for you already. So let's look at what our options might be like if we were going to do it ourselves, if we were going to do our own JavaScript stuff. And if you were going to write your own JavaScript animations by hand, requestAnimation frame is the way you want to go. You can tell by the name it's for animation. Well, that is true. Anyways, I'll work on those JavaScript jokes. They're the toughest ones for me. CSS jokes, though, got those down. So if we were going to do our own requestAnimation frame animation, we might do something like this. We would create some sort of function. This one is going to move a cat. You would never, ever guess that from the name. I name things good. I don't really. We would do some sort of math to be like, hey, cat, on every frame we want to change your position, change something about you. Because like, the definition of animation is changing some property over time, right? So we know this is going to cause us to get called every frame. So on every frame we need to do a little bit of math and be like, where are you now? How much did you change in value? Math some things. That's exactly what's happening there. And then be like, hey cat, go to that new place, right? So we're just kind of adding to its position on every frame. It's all happy, yeah. And then we have to actually do the whole requestAnimation thing here, animation frame thing here. And also most importantly, the very last line, call the function after you write it. I've never run into that problem, but I hear some people do. So that would be like a really basic structure of what we need to do, like even a small animation with requestAnimation frame. Essentially defining how it changes every frame, and then telling the browser, go call this every time a frame happens, please. If we make some longer variable names, use a real cat, this is space cat, and we applied that same mathing with longer variable names, we get this. Yeah, pretty impressive, right? I moved a cat. So then you get to the problem, or maybe to the next step where you're like, all right, what if we wanted the cat to like go back? What if we wanted the cat to use some kind of easing other than linear? We just had a constant speed that whole time, right? That's why he's in space, because it's possible there. But on Earth, that's not possible. We need to like accelerate and decelerate and stuff. We can't just like have our bodies half off the edge of space like that. It just doesn't work. So if we wanted to use some different easing, we'd have to do some different calculations in each of our requestAnimation frame calls. If we wanted to like make the cat go back and forth or have multiple cats, we have to do even more effort within our requestAnimation frame. So this starts getting you to the point of realizing why JavaScript animation libraries exist. when you use, like the libraries essentially all boil down to requestAnimation frame calls in the end, but they give you a lot of shortcuts to common things that you want to do, and also helpful things to smooth over browser inconsistencies, helpful things to do performance stuff, so you don't have to write it out all by hand. If you just have like one or two little things you're doing, by all means, go write it by hand. It'll be totally fine. If you're doing many things, you probably want to start looking at a library. Ooh, I forgot the dessert. There we go. Now you recognize it. At first you're like, I don't know. Oh, Sunday, okay. So JavaScript animation libraries, it's like one of those things where there's just so many of them. Like there's like any sort of thing you can get from like a little library of just like easy equations you can use in your own requestAnimation frame animations, all the way to these like fully built out like animation platforms that do like anything you can imagine under the sun with JavaScript. So there's this huge, huge spectrum available. And yeah, there's so many. So we're even getting one more level into it depends. We're like, I need someone's help, which one do I use? So I figured I would go over a little bit of how I would compare some JavaScript animation libraries. I think that's better than just telling you which my favorite one is. Because actually, I actually, on my most recent project, used a library that was different than my favorite one. I almost feel like I shouldn't admit that. I was like, oh, I have different requirements. I'm going to have to use something different. It was actually kind of fun. But anyways. So if I was going to choose some animation libraries, I was going to start comparing some. I'm going to stick to the ones that kind of do the most work for me, the ones that are more like full-featured animation libraries, the ones that give me more than just easing functions, because I feel like if you're going for some extra help on these animations to make yourself be a little more effective, you probably want that extra bit of scaffolding. So at first I thought, oh, I'll go to one of those like JavaScript statistics sites and find out which animation libraries get used the most, or like have the most includes or whatever that they measure. That's a really bad idea, because most of those statistics sites like search back through the whole internet back in time. So the #1 animation library on all of those is jQuery. Don't do it. I'm like, no, I can't put that in my comparison. The web has come a long way in animation libraries since jQuery. It just doesn't have the flexibility that a lot of these newer ones do. So that one was not happening. So I'm like, all right, I'm going to narrow it down to a list of 3 libraries based on like kind of what I see being popular out there in the world, because those numbers just let me down. So let's go by what's popular. So I shortened my list of 3 to the GreenSock animation platform. And because they're one that they've been around for a long time, I see people use them a lot in CodePen, so I'm like, they might have something good going there. Then I also would put Velocity on my list, because that's another one that's been out there for a long time. For a while it wasn't being maintained, but now it is again, so like maybe it's time to give it another look. I don't know. And 3 is a good number, so I decided I would also look at Anime.js, because this is one that I've seen Mary Lou use a bunch on Code Drops, and she makes some awesome demos there. So if Anime can do her awesome demos, maybe it can do my like day job work. Who knows? So narrowing it down to something to compare, I think it's a really good first step, because if you're just, like if you don't know what you're comparing, how do you make that decision unless you just kind of blindly choose? So before I get into the differences of them, I wanted to show you one thing one thing they all have in common. And I feel like they almost don't want you to know this, because all of them have marketing sites like, we are the best animation engine, most performance, and they wave their arms. It's very awkward. But like they can't all be the best of all the same things, right? So their job is to make themselves seem really different. But I've noticed there's a very common thread between all of these libraries. So, and it's all in the way that they are written and the way they're coded. So I'll show you a comparison of all of those 3. So if we wanted to have GreenSock do a thing, animate a thing, we would do this. We would be like, hey, tween max, because that's what GreenSock calls itself. Why would you have 1 name when you can have 2? I have no good answer to that. We'd be like, hey, tween max, take this box, and over 1 second, change the opacity to half of what it is, move it 800 units over, and use the power to ease in easing, right? Not bad. Kind of almost makes sense. It's almost like you're saying it in words. If we wanted to do that same thing with velocity, we would be like, hey, velocity, take this box, change the opacity, you get the idea, take 1 second, 1,000 milliseconds is 1 second, and use the easing of ease in quad. You're like, besides the brackets and the different names of the easing, those look really similar. And then, just to really prove the point, if we want to do that same thing in anime, we'd be like, hey, anime, take this box, do the stuff that I said before, take 1 second, and use the ease in quad easing. So but really all doing a very similar thing, right? The brackets, things are in slightly different places, your semicolons and everything, but really, at the base of it, really similar things going on. And I like to show this just to say that, you don't have to, if you learn one, it's not that you couldn't switch to another for a different project. Or if you learn one and you're like, oh, it's not going to work for me in this particular case, switching to another one is really about as hard as learning where the commas and semicolons go. It's not so bad. So, with that said, let's look at the differences. And for that, I would make a table. That's what you do when you compare things, right? Spreadsheets. I spared you the Excel and just did it here. So the first thing I might look at is file size. How big are these things? How much am I going to have to load into my page or my app to get this stuff done? GreenSock has a variety of configurations, and they range from a size of about 9 kilobytes to 29 kilobytes gzipped. I did get these numbers a few weeks ago, so they may have changed. Disclaimer for number things. To be honest, the stuff that you get for the 9 kilobytes isn't going to get you really far, so usually you have to have at least 12 to get things done. Velocity has one version of itself, and it's around 14 kilobytes gzipped. And you're like, okay, interesting, interesting. Anime also only has one version of itself, and it's only like a little under 5K gzipped. So you're like, major differences so far. Interesting. Tell me more. So I might also look at browser support. I hear that's a thing. I guess you've also heard that's a thing. GreenSock can support things all the way back to IE8, which Velocity also all the way back to IE8. Anime only back to IE10. And if you're super into browser trivia and things, or maybe you're going to a browser trivia night later, requestAnimation frame is only supported IE10 or above. So GreenSock and Velocity must be doing something for a fallback for that requestAnimation frame. I almost said animation train. Someone make that a thing. To get it further back to the versions of IE. So maybe that's part of why their file size is bigger. Ooh, interesting. I might also look at where I can get help. I don't know about all of you, but sometimes I tend to do work the day before it's due, and I'm like, oh crap, it's broken, help me, internet. So GreenSock has some documentation, has some forums, some pretty active forums. People answer a lot of questions for each other, that's great. Velocity has documentation as well, and it's kind of all over Stack Overflow, so they don't have their own forums, but that's pretty helpful. Anime just really has their documentation. They're newer, so they don't have a lot of forums or community around it, but their documentation is actually probably the most nicely designed of all three. And I judge people on that, good color choice, I'll use your library. No, I use more logic than that most of the time. I might also look at any special features they have. So, for example, GreenSock has some particular plugins for Draw SVG, Morph SVG, and Draggable. So if I was doing some complex SVG things, that might be the thing that puts me over the edge. Velocity's thing, their kind of claim to fame is they are a drop-in replacement for jQuery. So if you're working on a team that's writing a lot of jQuery or is really familiar with jQuery and you want them to not use jQuery, you could just basically swap this out and they wouldn't know. It's like changing their sugar for Splenda or something. So I mean, that could totally be the thing you need. But an amazing thing is that it's very lightweight compared to some other ones. And if it does what you need and you're looking for the smallest possible thing, maybe that might be where you go. You can also look at pricing and licensing. GreenSock does have some features that require licensing or money. So for some people that's a deal breaker, for some people that's cool. Both Velocity and Anime are MIT licensed, so they are free all the time, no matter what. So even though these three libraries all do very similar things, and they all basically are a solution to very similar problems, there's some nuanced differences between them that could really influence your choice of what might be best for your project, or what might be best for today's project versus yesterday's project. You might have a different one you choose based on what you're doing. So to summarize, our friend JavaScript, because I decided it's our friend too, not just CSS's. I mean, why should CSS have all the friends? We should also have friends. It's really great, complex UI animations, and with a lot of things going on, all those examples that we looked at. Any animation of dynamic states, and things that are more immersive in storytelling. Because that additional bit of logic and knowledge that JavaScript can tap into can really make it easier and more effective for doing these more immersive things. Its biggest advantage is you have so many options to get it done. Once you've decided you're going to go JavaScript, you sort of have this giant landscape of things to choose from. So whatever requirements you need, whatever browser things you need to support, there's going to be some kind of option for you. And it can animate literally all the things. It can animate DOM objects, SVG, it can do canvas. Is there anything JavaScript can't do? I don't think so. So it's one, it can be like one source for controlling a whole lot of objects. If you like power, if you like to feel in control. Anyways, let's move on to our next island, which is SVG Island. It has some serious looking rocks. Don't let that fool you. SVG is still a friendly thing. My favorite thing about SVG is like, this is SVG, and so is this. This is the same thing as that. Dogs, also dogs. Isn't that cool though? I mean, it's like SVG is just like shapes and objects and cute furry puppies described in math. How is that not awesome? So this is what really comes down to the strength of SVG. All of these little pieces of the dog are actually objects in an SVG file. Your SVG has a DOM, so you're putting a DOM inside your DOM. Oh my goodness. And they're all actual objects, they're actually there, and they're described with math, which is why SVGs can be so tiny. So the things SVGs are awesome at, animated illustrations or animated icons. You might think those are the same thing, but your illustrator or icon drawing friend will disagree with you. Things that are more infographic or data viz related, things that might need objects to represent data. Ooh, sounds good for SVG, doesn't it? And anything that needs to be like fluidly scaling or like responsive to that extent. Like SVGs, based on their vectorness, basically can be any size you want them to be. They don't care, they're like, give me some space, I'll fill it. It's cool. So they can be really fluid and also, in that sense, also very responsive. So let's look at some examples. There's things like the bustle flowcharts, where this is all one giant SVG. And then they move you around it like you have an SVG camera, which is called the VBox. And they just take you through this quiz. It's all one giant SVG, so they can make this quiz be full screen, they can make it be half screen, they can make it be quarter screen. You get the idea. And it would work. I mean, it might get a little too small to read in some of those cases, but it would still totally function. So that's pretty cool. It's also really great for logo animations. My rule is kind of like, hey, if someone's talking about animating a logo, just mention SVG right away. Just be like, yes, that's what we're doing. Chris Gannon does a lot of logo animations in SVG. This is one of them. It's pretty fun. You're like, ooh, who wouldn't want their logo to do that? No one. SVG is also really great at shape morphing. So if you ever want to make like a menu thing turn into some kind of food item, not what you were expecting, was it? But it works. If you want lines to turn into pizza, SVG is your friend. It can do it for you. And I also, like, when I saw this one that Chris put up, I was like, well, so why didn't we go with the pizza menu? I mean, why the hamburger? Why not pizza? So many questions. Anyways, SVG can also be really great for things like onboarding, where you're kind of telling these little bits of stories to kind of explain how something works. This is an onboarding sequence from StoryTrail, and each one of these little scenes is an animated SVG. They just kind of cycle through them. They're nice and contained, because like that whole building scene is one SVG. That whole guy walking with his backpack was one SVG. And it's a really nice way to work with those. Also, anytime you want straight lines to not actually be straight lines, you just want them to kind of mush around a little. SVG's like, I can mush. It's cool. Good with it. Ooh, you thought those were straight lines. You were so wrong. That's all I'm done with SVG and all of those things, being very like morphy and all of that stuff. That's one of the biggest advantages of SVG. If you want that look, it is the place to go for it. This goes on forever, so I'm just going to go to the next slide. You should really edit your videos for your talks. Little point, whatever, tip there. So when it comes to SVG, if we're like, we're going to do this SVG, guess what? One more level of it depends. Oh yeah. There are 3 ways to animate SVG. We could use Smile, but I wouldn't really totally recommend that because there's no IE or Edge support, and browser support moving forward and things like Chrome is questionable. So probably not Smile. If you're already using it, good for you, good stuff. If you were like thinking about learning it, I would suggest maybe not. Maybe not for current projects. We can also animate SVG in CSS. How cool is that for CSS? I mean, CSS used to like barely be able to underline text and links, and now it can like manipulate SVG objects. Oh, CSS is really growing up. So CSS is a pretty good option for some things when you want to animate your SVGs. You can use transitions and keyframes. You can apply those to SVG elements, even the inner SVG elements, the SVG innards, if you will. SVG only has a limited number of properties it exposes to CSS. That's not CSS's fault, it's SVG's fault. SVG is like, I'm going to keep some things to myself, thanks. This is changing with SVG too, so you might notice some demos on CSS tricks and stuff that have like manipulating SVG paths with CSS. So that's one of the newer things that will hopefully come to other browsers soon. The biggest drawback of animating SVG with CSS, though, is the fact that transforms of SVG child elements, so things within the SVG, so for our dog example, like animating its nose or its ears, all the cute stuff, are not supported in IE or Edge. You should totally bother the Edge people to support that, because it would be a cool thing to do. So that's something that maybe will change. I think will most likely change in the future. But for now, that makes CSS really great for things like small icon animation, things where the animation is an enhancement. So if someone shows up to your site in IE and they don't see it moving, it's not like they're missing any critical content. And then anyone who does see it moving is like, sweet, better icon than I saw last time. Our third option, which you may have guessed, this is like all totally coming full circle in a strange way, is animating SVG with JavaScript. It can animate any of the native SVG properties, because it doesn't wait for SVG to reveal things in it for it. It just like reaches in and grabs the attributes. It's very, I don't know, that makes it sound much more violent than it really is. Like I said, they're friends, they're cool with it, they share things. So we can get to any of the SVG properties with JavaScript. It has a little more power in that sense. And it can do pretty much all of the things Smile could do. One of the big arguments against getting rid of Smile was the fact that it used to be the only option for things like motional on the path and shape morphing and all those cool things that SVG could do. People were like, no, don't take that away from me. And then JavaScript was like, I can do it too. That must have been an awkward meeting. And I have a little asterisk there because you can do all of these things, like shape morphing and all that kind of stuff. The JavaScript library you choose to use may make things like morphing and motional on the path easier or harder depending on what you want to do. Or if you want to do it by hand, wow, I'm impressed. So if those things are important to you, you want to make sure the library you're using has that functionality. Because it is possible, it's just not everything does it in an intuitive way. So if you're doing any sort of complex SVG animation, things that are more illustration, storytelling, more of that onboarding type stuff, things that are critical to be seen in all browsers, JavaScript is probably your best solution, and it's pretty fun. So this is showing you which browsers support SVG. There's a lot of green here. For some reason, there's this misconception that SVG isn't supported in all browsers, but like we haven't got upper many. So the thing that's going to limit where your SVG animations, or like which browsers will support your SVG animations, the thing that's going to limit that is not SVG itself, but the technology you use to animate that SVG. Because Smile, CSS, and JavaScript, and even some specific JavaScript features have different browser support levels. So if your SVG animation doesn't play in a certain browser, don't blame SVG, blame yourself. Was that dramatic enough? I'm working on that one. All right, so SVG is super visual, and if you're like, I would like to work on my visual stuff and visual things, that's possible in some ways. The folks at Airbnb have put together this library called Body, where you can export SVG animations out of After Effects, as long as they're like shape layer animations, to this thing called Lottie, that will then put them on like iOS or Android or React Native. And Lottie is basically kind of two pieces. It's sort of like the thing that exports your SVG information from After Effects, and the thing that like sucks that information in for React Native, iOS, or Android. That's a very technical explanation of how it works. If you want to dig into how Lottie stuff works, there is a community site called Lottie Files, where there's actually example Lottie files that you can go and like dig into and see how they get exported and how you might be able to import them into your projects. That way you don't have to like go through the whole thing yourself. There's examples to look from. There's also a web version of Lottie, where you can actually have a web player for those animations you export out of After Effects. The weight of this player can be kind of heavy depending on what you're doing and what your goals are, but it is an option that's out there if that's a thing that appeals to what you need to get done. So, to summarize our friends, the SVG, because we are friends with all of these things now, clearly. It's really great. Illustrations, infographics, icons, those kind of things, SVG is wonderful at. Anything that needs to be vectory, so shape morphing, motional on the path, anything squishy, also SVG. And its biggest pro is just like how fluid and responsive it can be shape-wise. Like it can fill up any space you want it to. And that file size is so tiny because it's just math. Not dogs, just math, dog math, whatever it is. Or whatever you can put not dogs in SVGs, just so you know. Cats, things that aren't animals, all totally allowed. Oh boy. Anyways, so now that kind of concludes our little tour of the world of web animation. And hopefully now you have better more confidence in the next time you might need to answer this question. You'll be able to like get your right answer straight away, or the answer that fits what you need to do best right away. It'll be a little less mysterious and a little less full of it depends. We talked a lot about code stuff just now, and like implementation and tech side of things. If you're interested in more of the design side of things, I wrote a book called Designing Interface Animation that Oliver mentioned earlier. Covers more of the design side, also has pictures of dogs though, so don't worry, you're covered on all bases. And with that, thanks so much for listening, everyone.